The night was soaked in rain, the porch light flickering like it might go out any second. Her voice broke through the storm, sharp and cold. "Get out, old man." I stood on the wet steps, suitcase in hand, watching her silhouette disappear behind the locked door, the same door I'd guarded for decades. The garden smelled of crushed chrysanthemums, heavy with rain and memories I wasn't ready to let go of. By sunrise, the world would flip, and I'd be the tenant in my own house. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below, and don't forget to press the subscribe button. The mornings in my hometown had a way of arriving gently, not with the blare of alarms or the rush of traffic, but with the measured rhythm of doves cooing in the elm outside my window. I would wake to that sound, to the pale gold of sunlight filtering through thin lace curtains, and to the steady comfort of knowing the house was mine, ours, in the truest sense of the word. This was the home I had bought with Margaret, my wife, 42 years ago. I can still see the way her eyes had widened when we first stepped inside, the worn oak floors, the bay window in the living room that faced the street, and the small garden patch in the back that she said would be our little piece of Eden. We didn't have much then, just our savings, a box of hand-me-down furniture, and the stubborn belief that love was enough to make a place feel like a castle. When Clara was born, that belief seemed to prove itself. I can still remember the morning I brought her home from the hospital. The air was warm for April, the lilacs were just beginning to bloom. I walked her from room to room, whispering introductions to walls and windows as if the house might bless her. Her first steps were taken on that oak floor, her first words spoken in the kitchen while Margaret rolled out biscuit dough. Those were years of simple rituals. Saturday mornings, I'd push Clara's blue bicycle out of the shed, tighten the chain, and watch her wobble down the sidewalk until she found her balance. On summer evenings, Margaret would hum while we ate watermelon on the porch, spitting seeds into the grass. And in winter, the three of us would crowd around the fireplace, the smell of pine logs filling the room, as the wind rattled the eaves. Even after Margaret passed, quietly, one September morning with the light streaming across her pillow, I found comfort in the routines she'd left behind. I kept the garden neat because she would have wanted it that way. I made Sunday tea because that's what she used to do. And when Clara called, I'd tell her about the little things, the robins nesting under the porch, the way the chrysanthemums were coming in early. But over the years, those calls grew shorter. She was busy, she said. New job. New city. New friends. When she did visit, she brought the hurried air of someone between obligations, her phone never far from her hand. I told myself it was just the way life moved, children grow, and the world pulls them forward. Still, I noticed the spaces between us widening. The last time she came for Christmas before moving away, she brought store-bought cookies instead of baking with me. She left early the next morning, citing a work deadline. After she drove away, I stood in the doorway, the cold wind blowing in, and felt a hollowness I didn't want to name. Years passed like this, me tending to the house, her living somewhere in the blur of city lights. And then, one spring, she called. Her voice was thin, quieter than I remembered. She'd had a breakup, she said. Needed a place to stay, just for a while. The day she arrived, it was raining, not hard, just a steady drizzle that softened the air. She stood in the doorway with her suitcase, hair damp, eyes tired. Without thinking, I hugged her. Without asking, I gave her the master bedroom. I told myself it was a chance for us to be close again, to fill the spaces that time had emptied. At first, it was almost like the old days. We had breakfasts together, toast, eggs, and coffee for me, tea with honey for her. We talked about small things, the neighbor's new dog, a movie she'd watched. I tried not to ask about the breakup. I thought if she wanted to tell me, she would. And I thought, perhaps foolishly, that the quiet hours we shared meant she was finding her way back, both to herself and to me. But even in those early weeks, I noticed something I didn't want to acknowledge. The rain seemed to linger longer than the forecast promised, the garden's soil staying dark and wet. And in her eyes, there was a distance, like she was here, but not entirely. I told myself it was just the aftermath of heartache. I didn't yet know it was the beginning of something far colder. The first morning after Clara moved back in, I woke to the sound of her in the kitchen, the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain, the low hum of the kettle. It had been years since I'd heard those small, domestic noises coming from anywhere but my own hands. For a moment, lying there in the half-light, I let myself believe we were back in some earlier chapter, before she had moved away, before time had turned our conversations into quick updates over the phone. I had given her the master bedroom without hesitation. It still carried traces of Margaret, the cream curtains she'd sewn herself, the old oak dresser with the slightly warped top drawer. Clara had slept in that room as a child when she was frightened by storms, curled up in the middle of the bed while rain tapped the windows. Giving her that space again felt like tucking her under a familiar quilt. In those first days, we settled into a quiet rhythm. I made breakfast, eggs, toast, the occasional fried tomato, and she sat across from me with her tea, always sweetened with too much honey. Sometimes she'd ask about the garden, or about a neighbor she vaguely remembered. Other times, we'd sit in companionable silence, the clock ticking between us. But in the evenings, the house changed. She would retreat to her room, door closed, her voice carrying in muffled fragments through the walls. At first I thought she was calling old friends, or maybe a coworker. I didn't press. Privacy, I told myself, is a kindness. One night, though, as I passed her door with a basket of laundry, I heard her laugh, a bright, practiced laugh I didn't recognize, followed by words that rooted me to the hallway. "This house will be mine soon," she said, her tone light but certain. There was a pause, then another voice, a man's, murmured something I couldn't catch. She laughed again, softer this time. I stood there for a long moment, laundry growing heavy in my arms. My first thought was that I had misheard. My second was that maybe she meant something else entirely. But the sentence lodged itself in me like a splinter. The next day, I looked for signs. There were small ones, barely noticeable unless you were searching. A stack of unopened envelopes on the kitchen counter, each with official-looking seals. The way she began answering the house phone before I could get to it, even though she had her own cell. When I asked who it was, she'd shrug and say, "Nobody important." She began changing little things in the house without asking, moving the armchair from its place by the window, taking down a photograph of Margaret from the hallway wall. I found it later in the linen closet, face down on a stack of towels. When I asked why, she smiled thinly. I thought the space needed a fresh look. Still, I wanted to believe her return was a bridge, not a wedge. So I stayed quiet. I told myself she was adjusting, that living together again after so many years would take time. And I clung to the moments when she seemed like herself, the afternoon she helped me prune the rosebush, the evening she made spaghetti and overcooked the noodles just like she used to. But even in those moments, there was a new sharpness to her, a glance that lingered too long on the deed framed in my study, a casual comment about how people our age sometimes needed to downsize. I laughed it off, though it didn't feel like a joke. One rainy afternoon, I came in from the garden and found her sitting at the dining table with a manila folder. She slid it closed as soon as she saw me. "Work stuff," she said, her smile a fraction too quick. The smell of damp soil clung to me as I hung up my coat, and for the first time in my own house, I felt like an intruder. That night, lying in bed, I listened to the rain against the roof and thought of Margaret. She had always believed the house was more than wood and nails, it was a promise, she'd say. A place where love lived. But now, I could feel the floorboards shifting beneath that promise, the slow settling of something unkind. And yet, the next morning, Clara greeted me with a bright, "Good morning, Dad," and a plate of pancakes. I ate them with a smile, though the taste was dulled by the echo of her words from that night. "This house will be mine soon." It began as small omissions, the kind that are easy to excuse if you want to. One Friday evening, I heard voices in the living room and thought Clara had invited some friends over. I stepped out to greet them, but the conversation stopped mid-sentence. She turned from the couch, smiled a little too brightly, and said, "Oh, Dad, I didn't think you'd be up." We were just about to head out. The "we" included two women and a man I'd never seen before, their eyes sliding past me like I was a piece of old furniture. Another time, I heard laughter from the porch. When I went to see what was so funny, I found her sitting with a neighbor, one I'd known for years, talking about neighborhood plans for the summer. When she noticed me, her tone shifted. "We'll catch up later," she told him quickly. He looked almost embarrassed as he left. Inside, the house felt different. Not in any way you could prove, the same walls, same creak in the floor near the hallway, but in the air itself. There was a heaviness, as if some of the warmth had been siphoned out without my noticing. She started snapping over little things. If I forgot to take my shoes off before stepping onto the rug, her eyes would narrow. If I left my reading glasses on the kitchen counter, she'd move them to my bedroom without saying a word. It wasn't anger, not exactly, more like the quiet disapproval you reserve for a stranger who's broken a rule you never agreed to. One afternoon, I noticed a thick envelope arrive in the mail. Before I could reach for it, she scooped it up and slid it into her bag. "Just bills," she said. The words were casual, but her hand stayed on the bag's zipper a moment too long. The garden, my refuge since Margaret's passing, became another source of tension. She began talking about modernizing it, replacing the flower beds with a gravel patio, for resale value. I told her the chrysanthemums had been here for decades, that they bloomed every autumn like clockwork, no matter the weather. She only shrugged. The worst moment came one morning over coffee. She sat across from me, scrolling through her phone, when she said, almost offhandedly, "I've been handling some of the paperwork for our home." I set my cup down slowly. "Our home?" She didn't look up. "Well, you know what I mean." I didn't, but I let it drop. My instinct was to avoid a fight, but inside, something shifted. The word "our" wasn't an accident. The days that followed were quiet, but not in a peaceful way. She spent more and more time in her room, the door closed, the low murmur of her voice on the phone seeping under the crack. Once, when I passed by, I caught the phrase, "as soon as it's in my name." I began to keep my own quiet watch. I checked the study drawer where I kept the house documents. Nothing was missing, but I started locking it anyway. I began writing dates on the back of important papers, taking note of when I last saw them. One evening, I came home from visiting an old friend to find the lock on the study door changed. When I asked her about it, she said, "Oh, I didn't think you needed to be in there anymore. I'm just organizing." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her. I simply went to the hardware store the next day and bought a new lock, putting the key on a chain I wore under my shirt. The house had always been a place where I moved freely, where I knew the rhythm of each room. Now, there were spaces I couldn't enter, conversations I wasn't part of, and a growing awareness that I was being pushed to the edges of my own life. And yet, there were still moments that disarmed me, an evening where she joined me in the living room to watch an old movie, her head briefly resting against my shoulder, a morning when she made oatmeal the way Margaret used to, with cinnamon and a slice of apple. Those moments kept me tethered, made me second-guess the unease that had taken root. But late at night, lying awake, I could feel it, the slow spreading of cracks beneath the floorboards, the quiet rearranging of something that had once been solid. I didn't yet know how deep they went, but I could hear them, faint but certain, like the first groan of wood before a house begins to settle. It happened over something so small, it would have been laughable if it hadn't been the opening strike. A coat. My old brown wool one, the one Margaret bought me the winter Clara turned 6. I'd left it hanging on the hallway hook closest to the door, the same place it had hung for decades. That morning, Clara came into the kitchen, her coffee in hand, and stopped short. "Dad, why is your coat there again?" I looked over from buttering my toast. It's where it's always been. She sighed, set her cup down too hard. We've talked about this. It's clutter. Guests see it the moment they walk in. We don't get many guests, I said gently. That's not the point. Her tone was clipped, final. She grabbed the coat and carried it toward my bedroom. The smell of rain still clung to the fabric from the day before. It should have ended there, just another small disagreement. But something in her tightened, as though she'd been holding in a dam's worth of water and the coat was the leak. You know, she said, standing in my doorway, this whole setup isn't really working. You need your own space. Somewhere smaller. Easier for you to manage. The words hung in the air. I set my knife down. My own space? I'm just saying, this house is a lot for you. You're not getting any younger. It might be better for you to. She stopped, her eyes flicking away. Let go of it. Move somewhere quieter. Maybe a retirement place. I felt the old floorboards under my feet, solid and steady, and something in me resisted the suggestion like a hand gripping a banister. I built my life here, I said. She crossed her arms. And I'm trying to make sure you're comfortable. You owe me at least that much after everything. Owe you? The words tasted foreign. For raising me right after Mom died. For keeping this house in good shape so you had something to give me. Her version of history was sharper than mine, cutting out the parts where I worked double shifts to pay the mortgage, where I sat through parent-teacher meetings alone, where I learned to braid her hair because Margaret couldn't anymore. I didn't argue. I've learned that in some storms, silence holds more ground than shouting. But over the next days, her suggestions grew bolder. She'd leave brochures for retirement communities on the counter. I'd find printed listings for apartments folded in the mailbox. One afternoon, she accidentally left a realtor's business card in plain sight on the kitchen table. She began talking about updating the house, stripping the wallpaper in my bedroom, replacing the worn oak floors with something more modern. I told her those floors were part of the house's soul. She laughed, a sharp little sound with no warmth in it. I started to notice the way she watched me, not with a daughter's concern, but like someone assessing a piece of furniture she wasn't sure was worth keeping. One evening, I walked past the living room and heard her on the phone. He's stubborn, she was saying. But I think he's close to giving in. It's just a matter of time. The old part of me, the one that still remembered her as the girl riding her blue bicycle down the street, wanted to believe she didn't mean it, that I'd misheard. But another part, the one that had been quietly watching the cracks spread, knew better. I kept my answers short after that. Kept my papers closer. The study key stayed around my neck even when I slept. She must have sensed my resistance because her efforts sharpened. She started rearranging the house, boxing up things I hadn't agreed to part with. She'd make little remarks when we passed each other in the hallway, you'd be happier with less to worry about, or, you know, most people your age start thinking about the next phase. One night, she stood in the doorway to my room, leaning against the frame. You can fight me on this, she said lightly, but in the end, I'll win. It's just how these things go. I didn't answer. I looked past her to the window, where the evening light was fading into the first signs of a storm. I knew then that this wasn't about my comfort. It was about possession. And possession was something I still had the strength to defend. If your own child started dropping hints that you should leave your home, how would you respond? After that night, Clara's warmth toward me didn't just fade, it shut off like a switch. Breakfasts became solitary affairs. I'd hear her in the kitchen before dawn, moving quietly, and by the time I came down, she was gone. The kettle still warm, her cup drying on the rack. The chair across from mine stayed empty. When we did cross paths, her words were trimmed down to the bare minimum. Morning. Mail came. Door was unlocked. It was the kind of silence that isn't born from lack of things to say, but from a deliberate withholding. I noticed small, practical shifts too. She began locking certain doors, first the linen closet, then the storage room off the hall. "I'm organizing," she said the first time I asked. But weeks went by, and I never saw anything being moved in or out. The study, my sanctuary for decades, became her next target. I came home one afternoon to find the door ajar and my papers shuffled out of their careful order. She'd left a realtor's business card on the desk, half tucked under the property deed as if to suggest they belonged together. I didn't confront her. Instead, I slid the deed into a heavy envelope, sealed it, and placed it at the back of the locked filing cabinet. The key joined the study key around my neck, a quiet weight against my chest. Outside the house, I noticed the change too. The neighbors, people I'd known since Margaret and I first moved in, began asking where I'd been. "Didn't see you at the block meeting last week," Mr. Harlan said, a hint of confusion in his voice. I hadn't known there was a meeting. "We missed you at Sunday lunch," Mrs. Keene told me. I hadn't been invited. It became clear that Clara was moving me out of the picture, socially as well as physically. Events that I had once been part of seemed to happen without my knowledge, and when I asked her about them, she'd shrug. "Oh, I didn't think you'd want to go. Too noisy." I took to spending more time in the garden, where her influence hadn't yet reached. The chrysanthemums were just beginning to push their green shoots through the soil, a stubborn, yearly reminder that life persisted on its own timetable. Out there, among the damp earth and quiet hum of bees, I could pretend for a while that the house behind me was still the home it had been. But the isolation crept in even there. One afternoon, I returned from trimming the roses to find the back door locked. I knocked, thinking she hadn't heard me, but when she opened it, her expression was flat. "Forgot you were outside," she said, stepping aside just enough for me to pass. At night, the silence felt heavier. I'd lie in bed and listen for the familiar sounds of the house, the groan of the floorboard in the hallway, the soft rattle of the old window latch, but instead, I heard her voice behind closed doors, low and urgent. Sometimes I caught my own name. Other times, phrases that made my chest tighten. "We just have to get him to agree, it'll be easier once it's done." I started keeping a notebook in the drawer by my bed, jotting down dates, overheard fragments, and anything that felt like it might matter later. It felt strange, recording my own daughter's movements as though she were a stranger I didn't trust, but trust was no longer something I could give her blindly. Then, one evening, I came home to find a set of unfamiliar keys hanging on the hook by the door. When I asked about them, she said, "Oh, just in case we need to change things around here." Her tone was casual, but her eyes didn't meet mine. That was when I began quietly gathering my own documents, the original mortgage receipts, the updated tax statements, my will. I made copies and kept them in a sealed envelope at a friend's house, just in case. The more she froze me out, the clearer her intentions became. She wasn't just waiting for me to move on, she was making the house less livable for me, piece by piece. But she underestimated something. Silence cuts both ways. If she wanted distance, I could give it to her, just enough to make her think she was winning, while I prepared for something she didn't see coming. It was a Thursday night in late October, the air heavy with the promise of rain. I'd spent most of the afternoon in the garden, trying to coax the chrysanthemums into fuller bloom before the frost set in. The light was fading when I heard the clatter of dishes and bursts of laughter from the kitchen. I stepped inside to find the house alive with voices, too many for me to recognize at once. Clara had set the dining table with my mother's china, the good set I'd kept tucked away since Margaret died. Candles burned in glass holders, and the air smelled faintly of rosemary and wine. Her friends filled the room, glasses in hand, chatting as if they'd been here 100 times before. Some I recognized from the occasional photograph on her phone, others were complete strangers. "Dad," Clara said when she spotted me, her smile polite but thin. "We're having a little dinner. I meant to tell you." "I see," I said, glancing at the plates, the extra chairs pulled from the study, the bottles of wine lined up like soldiers along the counter. Actually, she added, stepping closer, would you mind staying in your room tonight? Just so we can have the place to ourselves. It wasn't a request. I stood there for a moment, the voices of her guests carrying around us like a tide. One man gave me a quick nod before turning back to his conversation, as if I were the hired help. I can eat in the kitchen after you're done, I said evenly. She shook her head. It's better if you just keep out of the way. And then she was gone, her laughter already mixing with the others, leaving me in the doorway. I retreated to my room, closing the door softly behind me. Through the walls, I could hear them, forks against plates, bursts of applause at some joke, the clink of glasses in a toast. My name wasn't mentioned. My presence wasn't acknowledged. At one point, I caught her voice rising above the rest, well, I'll have the place to myself soon enough. Laughter followed, a chorus that seemed to press against my chest until it was hard to breathe. I sat on the edge of my bed, hands folded, staring at the pattern of shadows cast by the lamplight. The house felt smaller than it had ever felt, every sound from the dining room tightening around me like a rope. I thought of Margaret, of the nights we'd filled this room with quiet conversation, the smell of her tea, the warmth of her hand resting over mine. I thought of Clara as a little girl, running barefoot through the hallway, hair damp from her bath, laughing because she thought she could outrun bedtime. Somewhere along the way, that girl had turned into the woman on the other side of the wall, the one speaking about our home as if it were already hers. The laughter in the dining room grew louder, and then, suddenly, the sharp crack of rain against the windows announced the storm's arrival. I sat very still, listening to the downpour blur the edges of their voices. By the time the house quieted again, it was nearly midnight. Doors closed, lights went out, and footsteps retreated upstairs. I stepped into the darkened hallway. The air smelled faintly of wine and rosemary, the remnants of a meal I hadn't been welcome to join. The candles had burned low, their wax spilling in pale rivulets across the tablecloth. In that moment, I realized the shift was complete. This wasn't my home in practice anymore, it was hers, and I was just occupying space she hadn't yet taken. But storms have a way of clearing the air. I knew, standing there with the rain lashing the windows, that the next move would not be hers. That night, I slept lightly, the rhythm of the storm pulling me in and out of dreams. At some point, I woke to the sound of wind rattling the shutters, and for the first time, I felt something other than hurt. I felt ready. The rain hadn't stopped since the night before, a steady curtain against the windows that turned the morning gray and the garden soil dark as coffee grounds. I'd spent most of the day in my room, the muffled hum of Clara's voice on the phone drifting in and out. By evening, the storm had deepened. Thunder rolled somewhere far off, slow and deliberate, like the clearing of a throat before a verdict. I was in the kitchen, rinsing a teacup, when she came in. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes sharper than I'd seen them in weeks. "Dad," she began, the word tight with impatience, "we need to talk." I set the cup down, water still dripping from my fingers. "Go ahead. I can't do this anymore. This arrangement. It's not working." She gestured toward the ceiling, as if the house itself were the problem. I waited, saying nothing. "You're holding me back," she continued. "You don't see it, but I can't move forward with my life while you're clinging to the past." I let the silence stretch. The only sound was the rain pattering against the kitchen window. "This is my home too," she said finally, voice rising. "And you," she stopped, catching her breath. "You need to go. Find somewhere that suits you. Somewhere smaller, quieter. This place," her hand swept through the air, dismissive, "is too much for you now." I dried my hands slowly on a towel. "This house was bought with your mother. Paid for with my work. It's my name on the deed." Her eyes flashed. Not for long. Something inside me went very still. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and slow, beneath the drum of rain. "I'm not leaving," I said. The words seemed to ignite something in her. She stepped closer, voice breaking into a shout. "Get out, old man." For a moment, the words didn't register, not fully. I saw her mouth move, saw the way her shoulders tensed, the faint tremble in her hands. Then the meaning hit, sharp as glass. The sound of the storm filled the space between us. She reached for the suitcase that had been sitting near the door, the same one I'd kept half-packed in recent weeks, more out of quiet instinct than plan. She pushed it toward me. "Take your things and go. Now." I looked down at it, the worn leather darkened by years of use, the brass clasps dull in the low light. Margaret had bought it for me when we took our first trip to the coast. I'd carried it to conferences, to family visits, to every place I'd ever come back from knowing this house was waiting. And now, my own daughter was using it as an exit cue. I didn't argue. I didn't slam doors or raise my voice. I simply took the handle, feeling the weight of it, not just the clothes inside, but the weight of everything unsaid. The porch light flickered as I stepped outside. Rain soaked through my coat in seconds, the cold wrapping around me like a second skin. The garden lay blurred in the downpour, chrysanthemums bowed but unbroken. I walked down the steps, the mud pulling at my shoes, and didn't look back until I reached the street. From there, the house was just a shape in the storm, her shadow moving past the window before the curtain fell into place. That night, I stayed at my friend Samuel's place. We sat at his kitchen table, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the pauses. I told him what had happened, not in detail, just enough for him to understand. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You're still the legal owner, you know. That hasn't changed." I nodded. "Not yet." He poured me a cup of coffee, strong and black, and slid it across the table. "Then don't let it." Later, after he'd gone to bed, I sat alone with the sound of the rain still pressing against the windows. In my pocket was a number I hadn't called in years, an old friend, now retired, who had once been the sharpest lawyer in town. I took out my phone, stared at the screen, and pressed the green button. By the time I hung up, a new plan had begun to take shape. It was quiet, solid, and as steady as the rhythm of the rain outside. If someone you loved threw you out, would you walk away or fight for what's yours? Samuel's spare room smelled faintly of cedar and laundry soap, the kind of clean, quiet space that settles around you like a blanket. But I didn't sleep much that first night away from the house. My mind was too busy unspooling the events of the evening, knotting them together with old memories until they became something heavier than grief. By sunrise, the rain had thinned to a soft drizzle. I sat at Samuel's kitchen table, coffee cooling in my hands, and went over my next steps in my head. The conversation with my old friend, the lawyer, replayed itself in fragments. "You still have the deed, yes?" "I do." "And your name is the only one on it?" "Yes." "Then you're not as powerless as she's making you feel." The certainty in his voice had been like a match in a dark room. I took the bus into town that morning, my coat collar turned up against the damp. The streets glistened with puddles, each one rippling with the slow fall of leftover rain. My destination was a modest office above a bakery, its windows fogged with the warmth from below. Inside, my friend, Thomas, greeted me with the same firm handshake he'd offered clients for 40 years. Retirement hadn't dulled him, if anything, the lines in his face only made his gaze sharper. We sat down with coffee between us, the smell of fresh bread rising through the floorboards. I laid the deed on his desk, along with the property tax receipts, insurance papers, and a few other documents I'd gathered in the days before Clara forced my hand. He leafed through them, nodding slowly. "This is straightforward," he said. "You're sole owner. That means you can decide who stays and on what terms." I leaned back. "I want to stay. But I also want to make sure she can't pull something like this again. Thomas tapped his fingers against the desk. Then you make it legal in a way she can't ignore. You rent to her. The idea caught me off guard. Rent to my own daughter? On paper, yes. That changes the entire power dynamic. She'd be your tenant, not your co-owner. If she doesn't pay, you have the right to remove her. Legally, cleanly. And you'll have the law on your side every step of the way. It wasn't the warm, fatherly solution part of me still wished for. But it was a solution. We spent the next 2 hours drafting the necessary paperwork. Thomas was meticulous, his pen scratching across the page as though each word were a brick in a wall. He pulled out forms for a lease agreement, notices, and a formal acknowledgement of tenancy. My name appeared in bold where the owner's should be, Clara's in the space for lessee. Once this is filed, he said, it's enforceable. She'll have 30 days to pay the first month's rent. If she refuses, you initiate proceedings. No emotion, no arguments, just the law. By the time we were done, a small but solid stack of documents lay neatly on the desk. Thomas slid them into a folder and handed it to me. Guard these. They're your shield now. I left his office with the folder tucked under my arm, stepping back into the cool damp air with a strange sense of steadiness. For weeks, I'd felt as though I were moving along a narrowing path, each step taking me closer to a cliff's edge. Now, for the first time, I could see the ground widening ahead. On the way back to Samuel's, I stopped at the bank to open a separate account for the rent payments, another layer of separation, another quiet reinforcement that the house was, and would remain, mine. That evening, I sat in Samuel's kitchen again, the folder open in front of me. The legal language was dry, but it carried a quiet satisfaction. Each clause was a small reversal of the humiliation I'd felt the night she shoved that suitcase toward me. Looks like you've got her boxed in, Samuel said, glancing over my shoulder. Not yet, I replied. But the walls are going up. Before bed, I took out the key to my study, the one I'd worn on a chain for months, and placed it beside the folder. I imagined returning to the house at sunrise, the air crisp and clean after the storm, and sliding that key into the lock again. Not as a guest. Not as a man being tolerated. But as the owner, the landlord, if she pushed me that far. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The rain had finally stopped, and through the open window came the faint scent of wet earth and the promise of a new kind of dawn. The morning I returned to town to set the plan in motion, the sky was washed clean from the storm. The air had that crisp edge you only get in late October, the kind that wakes you up before the first sip of coffee. I carried Thomas's folder in my satchel, its weight both physical and symbolic. Every page inside was another plank in the bridge I was building back to my own front door. My first stop was the county recorder's office. It was a squat brick building with scuffed floors and a faint smell of old paper. The clerk, a woman I'd known since her first summer job at the library, looked up from her desk and smiled politely. She didn't ask questions when I slid the forms across the counter, she simply stamped them with that decisive thunk that turns intentions into law. With the property's legal standing reaffirmed and the lease formally recorded, the house was once again locked to me in more than just memory. Clara's place in it, should she remain, was now defined in black ink. From there, I walked to a locksmith I'd used before, a quiet man named Harris who didn't talk much but noticed everything. He eyed the ring of keys I handed him. "Rekey the lot?" he asked. "Every door," I said. "Including the study." "Especially the study." By the end of the day, I had a small envelope of fresh brass keys in my pocket and a receipt folded into my wallet. Harris had also given me a spare set, which I tucked into an envelope and left with Samuel, a safeguard I'd learned never to underestimate. The final step was preparation for the moment of return. I went over the lease agreement with Thomas one more time. Every clause was airtight. Clara would have 30 days to begin rent payments. If she failed to comply, the eviction process would be clear and unassailable. For now, she knew nothing. From her perspective, I was still the man she'd thrown out into the rain, displaced, stripped of authority, perhaps even willing to fade quietly into the background. That illusion was the best camouflage I could ask for. In the evenings, I walked the streets near Samuel's house, letting my mind settle. I'd pass homes with their porch lights glowing warm against the early dark, catch the scent of someone's stew on the wind, and think of my own kitchen. I wondered if she had moved my things from the cupboards, if she'd left the garden gate unlatched, if the chrysanthemums had survived the storm. On the fourth morning after the papers were filed, I returned to the house for the first time since the expulsion. I didn't go in. I stood across the street in the shadow of an elm and simply watched. Curtains drawn. A faint plume of smoke from the chimney. No sign she'd noticed the storm had left one of the gutters half detached from the roofline. I thought of Margaret, of how she would have hated the coldness between us, but also of how she'd never have allowed herself to be pushed out of her own home. "You keep what's yours, Henry," she used to say. "Not because you're stubborn, but because you built it with your own hands." When the chrysanthemums began to bloom again, late but still defiant, I took it as a small, private omen. Their yellow petals were bright against the damp soil, each one curved like a shield. They had weathered storms before, so had I. By the week's end, everything was ready. The documents were filed, the locks replaced, the lease printed in duplicate and signed by me as landlord. All that was left was the delivery, the sunrise return to my own front door. I spent that night at Samuel's in a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in months. No anger, no racing thoughts, just a patient readiness. The kind you get when you know the tide has turned, even if no one else has noticed it yet. At dawn, I woke without an alarm. The sky was a pale gray, streaked with the faintest blush of pink. I put on my coat, slipped the folder into my satchel, and felt the cold metal of the keys in my pocket. It was time to go home. The street was quiet when I walked up it that morning, the kind of hush that comes before the day fully wakes. My breath came out in pale clouds. The satchel at my side felt heavier than its contents, as if the folder inside carried not just papers, but every silent resolve I'd gathered over the past week. The house appeared through the thinning mist, familiar in every way and yet, from this distance, strange. The curtains in the living room were drawn. The garden was still damp from the storm, the chrysanthemums lifting their heads toward the pale morning light. Their yellow petals looked brighter than I remembered, like they were standing guard. I climbed the front steps slowly, the wood damp beneath my shoes. The new key sat cold in my palm, but I didn't use it. Instead, I knocked. After a pause, footsteps approached from inside. The door opened a crack, then wider. Clara stood there in a robe, hair pulled into a careless knot, a mug in one hand. Her expression shifted from surprise to irritation in less than a heartbeat. "Dad," she said flatly. "What are you doing here?" I met her eyes. "I live here." She scoffed, leaning against the doorframe. "Not anymore, you don't. You left." I slipped my hand into the satchel and drew out the folder. "I left," I said, "to take care of something important." Her gaze flicked to the folder, then back to my face. "What is this? Some sort of guilt trip?" I handed her the top document, the lease agreement, printed neatly with both our names. My signature marked the space for landlord. Hers appeared at the bottom, copied from an earlier document she'd once signed without reading, when I'd helped her with paperwork she claimed was tedious. That earlier signature was now lawfully bound to this agreement. She frowned as she scanned the first page. "What the hell is this?" "A lease," I said evenly. "You are my tenant. 30 days from today, your first rent payment will be due. If it isn't made, I will have no choice but to terminate your tenancy." Her laugh was sharp, incredulous. "You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious. This house is mine, in title, in record, in every legal sense. You've been living here without any formal arrangement. Now you have one. The mug in her hand trembled slightly. You're doing this to me? To your own daughter? I kept my voice calm. You made your position clear when you told me to get out. I am simply giving you the same choice you offered me, leave, or live here under terms you didn't write. For a moment, I thought she might slam the door in my face. Instead, she stepped back, letting me cross the threshold. The warmth of the house closed around me, carrying scents I both recognized and didn't. Coffee, yes, but also a trace of something floral I hadn't used since Margaret was alive. I set the folder on the hall table, the papers neatly aligned. Everything you need to know is in there, I said. Dates, amounts, conditions. She didn't touch it. Her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. You think this is over? You think I'll just accept this? I think, I said, meeting her gaze, that the law doesn't care what either of us thinks. It cares what's written down. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. Outside, a single drop of water fell from the gutter, darkening the porch rail. Finally, she said, "You've changed." I shook my head. No. I've remembered who I am. With that, I stepped past her toward the kitchen, the familiar creak of the floorboard greeting me like an old friend. Behind me, I heard her footsteps retreat to the stairs, each one sharp against the wood. I didn't look back. If you had the power to quietly turn the tables on someone who wronged you, would you use it? The first week after I returned was a lesson in how silence can be louder than words. Clara avoided me whenever she could, moving through the house like a shadow, there one moment, gone the next. We passed in hallways without acknowledgement, her eyes sliding past mine as if I were a stranger who had wandered in from the street. Meals became a silent standoff. I would be in the kitchen making coffee when she'd enter, only to wordlessly open the fridge, retrieve something, and leave without a glance. Once, she sat at the table scrolling through her phone while I ate. The only sound between us was the steady tick of the wall clock, marking time in an unbroken rhythm neither of us spoke to. The lease sat on the hall table for 3 days before she touched it. I came home one afternoon to find it gone, replaced by a thin envelope on my desk. Inside was a single sheet, her attempt at a legal challenge, hastily printed from some template she'd found online. I didn't even have to show it to Thomas to know it wouldn't stand. Every line was countered by the papers we'd filed at the county office. I left her a note, "Your objection is noted. The lease remains in effect." After that, the temperature in the house seemed to drop another degree. Some nights I'd hear her upstairs, pacing her room. Once, I caught a muffled sob through the door, whether from frustration or some other hurt, I couldn't tell. But she didn't come to me, and I didn't go to her. We had chosen our sides. The strangest part was how normal certain things looked from the outside. The garden still bloomed, the mail still came, the kettle still whistled in the mornings. But beneath those familiar sounds and sights was a tautness, like a rope pulled so tight you could hear the fibers straining. One evening, she tried again to push back. We crossed paths in the living room, and she said, "You can't actually expect me to pay rent to my own father." I met her gaze evenly. "You didn't have a problem expecting me to leave my own home. This is the alternative." "That's not the same." "It's exactly the same," I said. "Except this way, you get to stay." Her mouth tightened. She turned and walked upstairs without another word. The next morning, I found the garden gate swinging open. At first, I thought the wind had done it, but the latch was unhooked. A small thing, but the chrysanthemums closest to the path had been trampled. Whether she'd done it deliberately or not, I didn't ask. I simply knelt in the damp earth, pressing the bent stems gently back toward the light. There were moments when I almost felt sorry for her. Pride can be a cruel companion, especially when it's asked to live under the same roof as humility. But then I would remember the rain in my face, the suitcase in her hand, and the cold in her voice when she told me to get out. That memory kept me steady. By the third week, she had stopped trying to negotiate. The deadline for the first rent payment was 10 days away, and I could see in her eyes that she was weighing her options. She made longer phone calls, some late into the night. Once, as I passed her door, I heard her say, "I'm not going to let him win." But in the garden, the chrysanthemums stood tall again, bright against the cooling air. I took it as a sign. Small victories were still victories, even if the larger battle had yet to be won. I began spending more time in the study, the smell of old paper and polished wood grounding me. The new lock clicked shut each time I left, the key warm against my chest by the end of the day. That room, at least, was untouchable now. On the morning of the final week before the deadline, I walked into the kitchen to find her sitting at the table with the lease in front of her. She didn't look up as she said, "You really think you've cornered me, don't you?" I poured my coffee and sat across from her. "I think you've left yourself very few doors to walk through. This one is still open." Her eyes lifted, sharp but tired. "And if I don't take it?" I sipped my coffee. "Then the door closes." We stayed there a moment, the clock ticking between us, neither willing to blink first. Then she gathered the papers, stood, and walked out, leaving the chair swaying slightly behind her. The house felt colder after she left for the day. But I knew, as sure as the chrysanthemums would bloom again next year, that the end of this chapter was only days away. The deadline came on a Tuesday, the air sharp with the first bite of November. I woke before dawn, not because I needed to, but because the weight of the day had been sitting on my chest all night. Downstairs, the house was still. I made coffee in the dim kitchen light, the faint hiss of the kettle the only sound. Outside, the chrysanthemums stood in their final bloom of the season, bright but fragile, their petals beginning to curl at the edges. 9 o'clock came. No envelope slid under my study door. No transfer appeared in the account I'd opened for the rent. The silence was its own answer. At 11, I printed the notice. The paper was plain white, the font matter-of-fact. Notice to pay or quit. 30 days overdue, no payment received. I signed my name at the bottom, landlord, owner, and slipped it into a manila envelope. I climbed the stairs slowly, the sound of each step carrying in the quiet. Clara's door was closed. I knocked once, twice. No answer. I slid the envelope under the door and stood there a moment, listening. A pause, then the scrape of movement inside. The envelope disappeared. Her voice came through the wood, sharp and disbelieving. "You're actually doing it?" "Yes," I said simply. The door opened just far enough for her face to appear, eyes narrowed. "You'd evict your own daughter?" I met her gaze. "You evicted me first. I'm just following the rules you set." For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then the door shut again, firm but not slammed. That night, I heard her pacing upstairs. Once, her steps paused over the spot in the hallway where the floorboard creaked, the sound stretching into a silence so long I thought she might come down. But she didn't. 2 days later, she began packing. Not in a rush, more like someone slowly accepting the shape of an inevitable truth. Boxes appeared by the door, sealed with too much tape. I didn't ask where she was going, and she didn't offer to tell me. On the final morning, she came down with the last of her things, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder, a folded blanket under one arm. We stood in the hallway, the air between us heavy with words neither of us would say. She looked at me, her face unreadable. "I hope you're happy." I thought of the night in the rain, of the suitcase she'd pushed toward me, of the weeks I'd lived under my own roof as if I were a guest. Then I thought of the chrysanthemums, still blooming outside despite the cold. "I'm not happy," I said quietly. "But I have my home back." She didn't reply. She opened the door, stepped out into the brittle morning air, and walked down the path without looking back. I stood there until she turned the corner and was gone. Then I closed the door, the latch clicking into place with a sound that felt final. In the living room, the light spilled across the oak floorboards, the same boards Margaret and I had polished together when the house was new to us. I walked over and placed my hand against the cool glass of the bay window, watching the garden. The chrysanthemums swayed gently in the wind, the last of their petals holding fast. The house was quiet again. Not empty, not lonely, just quiet. If you had to evict your own child for your dignity, could you bear it? Winter settled in quietly, the kind that doesn't announce itself with storms but with small changes, the way the mornings held their darkness longer, the way the air inside the house seemed to carry the faint scent of wood smoke no matter how often I opened the windows. The first week without Clara felt strange. I kept expecting to hear her footsteps upstairs, the creak of the hallway floorboard, the low murmur of her voice on the phone. But the house held its silence, and I began to realize how much I had been bracing myself for her presence, for her demands, her sharp glances, her absence even when she was in the same room. I rented the spare bedroom in the spring to a young couple named David and Elise. They paid their rent on time, kept the kitchen tidy, and often left a small loaf of bread or jar of honey on the counter for me. The house seemed to breathe easier with them in it. Clara hasn't called. I don't know where she went, and I haven't asked anyone to tell me. The urge to reach out is still there sometimes, late at night, when the wind presses against the windows, but I've learned to let it pass. Some distances are better left unclosed, at least for a while. In the shed, her blue bicycle still leans against the wall. The tires are flat, the paint chipped, but I can't bring myself to part with it. It's not a keepsake so much as a reminder of the years when love was simple, and of the truth that even then, change was already on its way. When the chrysanthemums bloomed again this autumn, they were brighter than I'd seen in years. I stood in the garden on a cool morning, my breath curling into the air, and thought of Margaret. She would have approved of how they'd weathered the storms, not untouched, but still standing. I closed the shed door, the faint scent of earth and rain rising around me, and walked back into the house. My house. And for the first time in a long while, the word home felt steady in my chest.